You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. What if I told you that most marriages don't collapse because of sudden betrayal or dramatic fights, but because of slow, invisible behaviors that are normalized, excused, and even encouraged? What if the real danger is what happens after the wedding, but what silently creeps in once comfort replaces accountability? If you're a man who has watched a strong relationship slowly drain your peace, confidence, and direction, this video is going to hit uncomfortably close to home. We're told that modern marriages fail because men don't do enough, do listen enough, or don't change enough. But what if that narrative only explains a fraction of the truth? What if the majority of marital breakdowns stem from patterns that are rarely questioned? Patterns that reward emotional chaos, punish masculine stability, and erode respect over time. This isn't about hate, it's about clarity. It's about seeing what most men are never taught to recognize until it's too late. And if you stay until the very end, you'll walk away with a mindset that can protect your marriage or save you from entering the wrong one. Watch closely. The final insight may change how you see relationships forever. Number 1. Unrealistic expectations, fueled by comparison. Unrealistic expectations don't appear overnight. They grow quietly, fed by comparison, watered by imagination, and reinforced every time you measure your relationship against an ideal that never had to survive reality. And if you're honest with yourself, you can feel this happening long before it becomes a problem. You scroll, you observe, you absorb impressions, and slowly a silent standard forms in your mind. You start believing that love should always feel exciting, that effort should always feel effortless, that your partner should instinctively know what you want without being told. And when that doesn't happen, disappointment slips in, not loudly, subtly, like a background noise you stop questioning. Stoicism warns you about this exact trap. Epictetus reminds you that it is not things themselves that disturb you, but your judgments about them. Comparison creates judgments faster than anything else. The moment you compare, you stop seeing what is and start chasing what you think should be. That gap between expectation and reality becomes the source of resentment, even if you never speak it out loud. And resentment doesn't need arguments to grow. It only needs silence and repetition. Here's the uncomfortable truth you need to sit with. Comparison doesn't raise standards, it fractures perception. When your expectations are built on images, narratives, or ideals instead of lived alignment, you begin demanding outcomes instead of cultivating connection. You expect your partner to perform a role rather than share a journey. And the more you expect, the less satisfied you feel, because expectations multiply when they're unmet. Warned you about this centuries ago when he said, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." That estimate is where the damage begins. You might tell yourself that high expectations are a sign of self-respect. Sometimes they are. But when expectations are fueled by comparison, they stop being standards and become fantasies. Fantasies don't adapt. They don't compromise. They don't care about context. And relationships require all three. When you hold someone against an imagined version of how things should be, you unknowingly place them in a position where they are always falling short, even on their best days. This is where Stoic discipline becomes practical, not philosophical. Stoicism doesn't ask you to lower your standards. It asks you to refine your perception, to separate what you can influence from what you can't, to release the illusion that happiness comes from alignment with external ideals. Seneca put it plainly, "He who suffers before it is necessary, suffers more than is necessary." Unrealistic expectations are pre-suffering. You're reacting to an imagined failure that hasn't even occurred. If you want to change this pattern, you have to interrupt it at the level of habit, not emotion. Habit. Start by noticing when your mind compares. Don't fight it. Just observe it. Each time comparison arises, pause and ask yourself one simple question. Is this expectation grounded in reality, or is it borrowed from imagination? This single pause weakens the automatic pull of comparison more than any argument ever could. Next, practice what Stoics called voluntary perspective. Once a day, intentionally reduce your expectations to the essentials. Strip everything down to character, effort, and intention. Not outcomes, not feelings, not fantasies. Write it down if you need to. This isn't about settling, it's about clarity. When you train your mind to value what is within human control, dissatisfaction loses its grip. Another powerful exercise is expectation fasting. For short periods, consciously let go of anticipating how things should feel or unfold. Enter interactions without scripting outcomes in your head. This doesn't make you passive, it makes you present. You'll notice how much tension disappears when you stop mentally rehearsing disappointment before anything has even happened. You also need to confront the identity that comparison creates. Comparison doesn't just judge your partner, it judges you. It convinces you that happiness is always somewhere else, just one adjustment away. That mindset is endless. There is no finish line. Stoicism brings you back to sufficiency, to the idea that peace comes from wanting less, not acquiring more. We suffer more often in imagination than in reality, Seneca said, and unrealistic expectations live entirely in imagination. Take action by redefining fulfillment as something you practice, not something you receive. Each day, choose one moment to consciously appreciate what already exists without mentally upgrading it. No comparisons, no internal commentary, just presence. This retrains your nervous system to feel contentment without stimulation, which is the foundation of emotional stability in any long-term bond. If you commit to this work, you'll notice something subtle but powerful. Your expectations won't disappear, but they'll soften. They'll become flexible instead of rigid. And flexibility is what allows relationships to breathe. Stoicism doesn't promise constant happiness. It offers something better: resilience, clarity, and peace of mind. And when you stop letting comparison dictate your expectations, you stop sabotaging connection from the inside out. This is where change begins, not by demanding more, but by seeing more clearly. Number 2, emotional decision-making over rational problem-solving. You're told that love should feel effortless, that emotion should always lead, that if something feels wrong, then it must be wrong. But this belief, when carried into marriage, quietly corrodes the foundation. Emotional decision-making replaces rational problem-solving, and instead of two adults confronting reality together, you get two inner worlds colliding. One reacts, the other defends, and nothing actually gets resolved. Stoicism warns you about this trap early. Wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." Sit with that. Emotional reactions feel authoritative because they're intense, but intensity is not truth. In many marriages, emotion becomes the judge, jury, and executioner. Decisions are made to soothe feelings in the moment rather than to solve the underlying issue. You don't get clarity, you get escalation. When emotion leads unchecked, problems stop being mechanical and become moral. Disagreement turns into personal offense. A solvable issue becomes a character flaw. Once that shift happens, logic is treated like coldness, and calm becomes suspicion. The marriage stops being a system to manage and starts being a battlefield of feelings. And feelings, by their nature, change constantly. You can't build stability on something that mutates daily. This is where you need to slow down, not to suppress emotion, but to put it in its proper place. Stoicism never told you to feel nothing. It taught you to feel without obeying. Epictetus was direct about this. It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them. Emotional decision-making is judgment without examination. Rational problem-solving is judgment after examination. In marriages dominated by emotion-first thinking, urgency replaces patience. Everything feels immediate. Everything feels like it must be addressed now. That pressure pushes people to act before understanding. You've seen how quickly words spill out when emotion is in control. Once spoken, they can't be retrieved. Damage accumulates not because the issue was large, but because the response was uncontrolled. If you want to change this dynamic, start by recognizing one truth. Emotions are signals, not instructions. They alert you, but they shouldn't command you. When emotion dictates action, responsibility disappears. I felt it, so I did it. That sentence quietly destroys accountability. Stoicism brings responsibility back into the room. It asks you to pause, to interrogate the feeling, to ask whether obeying it will improve the situation or simply discharge tension. Here's a simple practice you can begin immediately. When emotion rises, don't argue with it. Name it silently, just label it. No story, no justification, then wait. That small pause creates distance. In that distance, rationality has space to breathe. You're no longer a hostage to impulse. You're an observer choosing a response. Another exercise: write the problem in one sentence without emotion-laden words. No blame, no exaggeration, just structure. This forces your mind to convert chaos into clarity. Emotional thinking hates structure. Rational thinking thrives on it. By doing this, you retrain your brain to solve instead of react. Stoicism also reminds you that fairness matters more than feelings. Seneca said, "A sword is never a killer, it is a tool in the killer's hand." Emotion is the same. It isn't evil, but in untrained hands it becomes destructive. Marriage requires trained minds, people who can hold emotion without being ruled by it. When rational problem-solving leads, something powerful happens. Issues shrink to their actual size. Communication becomes cleaner. Silence becomes productive instead of threatening. You stop chasing emotional validation and start building emotional security. That's the difference between temporary relief and long-term stability. This isn't about winning arguments. It's about building something that can survive stress. You do that by choosing discipline over drama, clarity over chaos, and reason over reaction. Every time you pause instead of explode, every time you analyze instead of accuse, you strengthen the marriage's spine. Take action now. Practice restraint today. Delay reaction by minutes, then hours, then days. Train yourself to ask, what solves this? Instead of how do I feel right now? That shift alone can change everything. Stoicism doesn't remove emotion, it puts you back in charge of it. And when reason leads, marriage stops feeling like emotional roulette and starts becoming what it was meant to be: stable, grounded, and resilient. Number 3, constant need for validation and reassurance. The constant need for validation and reassurance doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself as a problem. It slips in quietly, dressed as love, concern, and emotional closeness. At first it feels harmless, natural even. Who doesn't want to feel chosen, desired, affirmed? But over time, when validation becomes oxygen instead of a bonus, the relationship stops being a partnership and turns into a pressure chamber. And if you're honest with yourself, you can feel the weight of that dynamic long before it ever gets named. Here's the uncomfortable truth you're rarely encouraged to face. When reassurance becomes a daily requirement rather than an occasional comfort, attraction erodes and respect thins out. Not because reassurance is wrong, but because dependency is exhausting. You weren't built to constantly prove your devotion, your loyalty, your love, your intentions. No human being thrives when they're placed in the role of emotional regulator for someone else's inner stability. Over time, that role breeds resentment, distance, and quiet withdrawal. Stoicism speaks directly to this pattern. even though it never uses modern relationship language. Epictetus warned that when you place your peace in the hands of another, you become their prisoner. Validation seeking is exactly that. It says, I cannot feel secure unless you keep confirming my worth. And the moment that belief takes root, love becomes fragile. Every silence feels like rejection. Every neutral expression feels like danger. Every small shift triggers the need for more proof, more reassurance, more emotional labor. What often goes unseen is how this dynamic slowly reshapes the relationship's emotional balance. One person becomes the seeker, the other becomes the stabilizer, and no matter how patient or loving you are, that imbalance eventually drains desire. Desire thrives on self-possession, not emotional hunger. Reminded himself daily that no one else was responsible for the condition of his soul. That mindset creates gravity. The opposite creates neediness, and neediness quietly repels. If you're willing to look deeper, you'll notice that constant validation isn't really about love at all. It's about fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of being replaceable, fear of not being enough unless someone else keeps confirming otherwise. And fear, when left unchecked, turns relationships into monitoring systems instead of spaces of freedom. You start measuring tone, words, attention, energy. You stop being present. You start managing outcomes. That's not intimacy. That's anxiety disguised as connection. Stoicism offers a different path, one that doesn't harden you or shut you down, but strengthens your emotional spine. Seneca wrote that the greatest remedy for anger, fear, and insecurity is delay and reflection. Instead of reaching outward for reassurance, you turn inward and ask yourself why the reassurance feels necessary in the first place. What belief inside you feels threatened? What story are you telling yourself in the absence of validation? When you learn to sit with that discomfort instead of outsourcing it, something powerful happens. You reclaim authority over your emotional state. This is where habits must change, not intentions. Wanting less reassurance isn't enough. You have to train yourself to self-validate. That doesn't mean arrogance or emotional coldness. It means learning to say internally, I know who I am, even if no one confirms it today. A practical exercise here is simple but uncomfortable. When the urge to seek reassurance arises, pause, breathe. Don't act on it immediately. Give yourself space to feel the discomfort without resolving it through someone else. Notice how the intensity peaks and then fades. That alone rewires your nervous system. Another practice drawn straight from Stoic thought is voluntary emotional restraint. Not suppression, restraint. You don't express every fear. You don't voice every doubt. You choose which emotions deserve air and which ones need discipline. Epictetus taught that not every impression deserves your assent. In modern terms, not every insecure thought deserves to become a conversation. Some thoughts exist to be mastered, not shared. As this habit develops, the entire tone of the relationship changes. Reassurance becomes a gift instead of a demand. Validation becomes meaningful again because it's no longer required for survival. And paradoxically, when you stop chasing confirmation, you often receive more of it. Not because you asked, but because emotional self-sufficiency is deeply attractive. It signals safety, stability, maturity. If you want to protect a relationship, or even just your own peace, you have to stop confusing constant reassurance with emotional depth. Depth comes from self-trust, from inner alignment, from knowing that your worth doesn't fluctuate based on attention, mood, or momentary distance. Wrote that a person who is disturbed by external things is not harmed by them, but by their own judgment of them. Let that sink in. The work is internal, always has been. So here's your challenge. Begin practicing emotional self-containment, not isolation, containment. Learn to hold yourself steady before reaching outward. Replace the habit of asking for reassurance with the habit of grounding yourself in what you already know. Do this consistently, and you won't just strengthen your relationships, you'll become unshakable within them. Number 4. Loss of respect due to contempt and criticism. Loss of respect never announces itself loudly. It arrives quietly, dressed as just being honest, as frustration, as eye-rolling thoughts you don't say out loud at first. And then one day the tone changes. Contempt creeps in. Criticism becomes reflexive, and something essential breaks. You feel it before you can explain it. Respect doesn't vanish because of one moment. It erodes because contempt becomes a habit and criticism becomes a language. As warned, the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. When thoughts turn corrosive, respect cannot survive. Contempt is especially destructive because it places you above the other person in your own mind. The moment you start seeing your partner as inferior, incapable, or disappointing by default, the emotional hierarchy shifts. You stop speaking to him as an equal. Your words sharpen. Your silence grows heavier. Even when nothing is said, the energy changes. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Respect is not something you can demand after you've mentally withdrawn it. Once contempt becomes your internal posture, it leaks into everything: tone, timing, patience, and presence. Criticism often feels justified in the moment. It disguises itself as logic, as correction, as helping him improve. But there's a difference between addressing behavior and attacking character. Criticism that targets who someone is rather than what they do slowly hollows out admiration. Over time, the man you once trusted begins to feel perpetually evaluated, not understood, not accepted, measured, and people rarely flourish under constant judgment. As Epictetus reminded, we are not disturbed by things but by the views we take of them. When your view becomes permanently critical, disturbance becomes the norm. What's dangerous is how normalized this dynamic becomes. Contempt doesn't always look like insults. Sometimes it's sarcasm. Sometimes it's chronic dissatisfaction. Sometimes it's the belief that appreciation must be earned again and again while criticism is freely given. And every time respect is replaced with superiority, intimacy collapses, desire fades, trust tightens, emotional safety evaporates. You may still be physically present, but mentally, the relationship becomes adversarial. Two people trying to win instead of understand. Stoicism offers a brutal but liberating mirror here. The Stoics taught radical responsibility over one's inner world, not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. Seneca wrote, "How much more grievous are the consequences of anger than the causes of it?" Contempt is anger that has calcified. Criticism is anger that believes it's righteous. And righteousness, when unchecked, becomes cruelty disguised as truth. If you want respect to return, you must first dismantle contempt at its root, inside your own mind. Not by suppressing frustration, but by interrogating it. Ask yourself, what expectation am I holding that was never clearly defined? What story am I telling myself about his intentions? Where am I confusing disappointment with moral failure? Stoicism demands precision of thought. Vague resentment is poison. Clear perception is medicine. Here's a practice you can begin immediately. For 7 days, observe your internal commentary. Not what you say out loud, what you think. Each time a critical thought arises, pause and mentally reframe it into neutral language. Not positive, neutral, strip it of judgment. This exercise isn't about denial. It's about accuracy. Respect grows when perception becomes fair instead of emotionally loaded. Another exercise, consciously practice delayed reaction. The Stoics called this the space between stimulus and response. When irritation surfaces, don't respond immediately. Sit with it. Let it cool. Advised, be tolerant with others and strict with yourself. That strictness isn't self-punishment, it's self-mastery. When you stop reacting impulsively, you stop feeding contempt. You must also relearn appreciation, not as performance but as posture. Appreciation isn't praise, it's recognition. It's the internal decision to see effort rather than deficiency. Make it a habit to internally acknowledge one thing daily that does not meet your expectations perfectly, yet still deserves respect. This trains your mind away from chronic criticism and back toward balance. The hardest shift is relinquishing moral superiority. Contempt thrives on the belief that you are more aware, more evolved, more right. Stoicism dismantles this illusion mercilessly. No one is exempt from human limitation, including you. When you accept this fully, criticism softens. Respect returns, not because the other person changed, but because you did. And here's the paradox most people miss. Respect is not sustained by control. It's sustained by restraint, by choosing not to weaponize insight, by choosing not to score points, by choosing composure over dominance. This is not weakness. It is power, quiet power, the kind that stabilizes relationships instead of destabilizing them. If you truly want to protect a marriage, start where the Stoics always start, with the self. Train your perceptions, discipline your reactions, remove contempt from your inner language, replace criticism with clarity. Because once respect is gone, love struggles to breathe. But when respect is restored, through conscious effort and inner work, everything else has room to heal. Take responsibility today, not for fixing another person, but for mastering the way you see, think, and respond. That is Stoic strength, and that is where lasting respect is reborn. Number 5, poor communication, masked as expressing feelings. Poor communication often hides behind the comforting phrase, "I'm just expressing my feelings." But what actually happens beneath that label is rarely clarity, truth, or connection. What you're usually witnessing is emotion being released without structure, accountability, or intention. Stoicism never taught suppression, but it warned relentlessly against unexamined expression, wrote that the soul becomes dyed by the color of its thoughts. When feelings are poured out without reflection, they don't cleanse the relationship, they stain it. You feel this when conversations spiral, when nothing gets resolved, when words land like fog instead of direction. You walk away tired, confused, and subtly blamed, even though nothing concrete was addressed. This isn't communication, it's discharge. And the more often it happens, the more the marriage quietly erodes. Here's the uncomfortable truth you need to grasp if you want strength instead of resentment. Emotion without precision creates chaos. When feelings are expressed as accusations, moods, tone shifts, or vague dissatisfaction, they force you into the role of interpreter, defender, or emotional regulator. You're expected to decode what was never clearly said. Over time, this trains you to walk on eggshells, to preempt moods, to guess instead of listen. Seneca warned that unchecked emotion is a form of slavery because it hands power to impulses instead of reason. A marriage built on emotional dumping slowly becomes a place where logic is punished and calm is mistaken for indifference. You stop engaging honestly, not because you don't care, but because every attempt at clarity turns into another emotional storm. You need to understand this distinction deeply. Expressing feelings is not the same as communicating needs. One relieves tension in the moment. The other builds stability over time. Stoicism teaches that speech should be deliberate, measured, and aimed at improvement. Epictetus reminded that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. When expression becomes constant and unfiltered, listening disappears. The marriage turns into a one-way emotional current, and you're expected to absorb it. This dynamic doesn't break relationships loudly. It weakens them quietly. Respect erodes first, attraction follows, trust goes last. If you want to step out of this pattern, you have to adopt a different inner posture. Not reactive, not defensive, grounded, calm, clear. You don't meet emotional chaos with emotional chaos, and you don't meet it with silence either. You meet it with structure. Stoic communication begins internally. Before responding, you pause and separate facts from feelings, yours and hers. You ask yourself what is actually being said, not how it's being delivered. This single habit alone changes everything, because it keeps you sovereign over your mind. Called this inner citadel, the place no one can invade unless you hand over the keys. You also need to stop rewarding poor communication with overengagement. When vague dissatisfaction receives excessive attention, it teaches the other person that clarity isn't required. Stoicism isn't cold, it's precise. You can acknowledge emotion without indulging confusion. You can say less, not more, calmly, slowly, with presence. This shifts the dynamic. Emotion either sharpens into clarity or loses its grip. Both outcomes are healthy. Here's a practical exercise to build this habit. Daily, practice translating emotion into language, first for yourself. Take any strong feeling and write it down in one sentence that includes responsibility, specificity, and direction. Not what you feel, but why and what would improve it. This trains your mind to value clarity over release. Another exercise, delay your responses. Give yourself space before reacting, even a few breaths. Seneca advised that the greatest remedy for anger is delay, but the same applies to all emotional exchanges. Time introduces reason. You're not here to suppress emotion, and you're not here to drown in it either. You're here to lead, with composure, with structure, with presence. Poor communication dressed up as emotional honesty is seductive because it feels authentic. But authenticity without discipline is just noise. Stoicism teaches you something better, truth spoken with control. When you embody that, the entire emotional tone of the marriage changes. You become a stabilizing force instead of a participant in confusion. And stability, over time, is what keeps marriages from quietly collapsing under the weight of misunderstood feelings. Take this seriously. Practice it daily. Watch how the atmosphere shifts, not because you demanded it, but because you mastered yourself. Number 6, prioritizing emotions over long-term stability. When wrote, the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts, he was pointing at something most people miss until it's too late. What you repeatedly prioritize doesn't just influence your mood, it quietly shapes the entire direction of your life. And when emotions are placed above long-term stability, especially inside marriage, the foundation begins to erode in ways that feel invisible at first. You don't notice it on day one. You feel it much later when the structure is already weak. You've been taught, directly or indirectly, that emotions are truth, that if something feels good now, it must be right. That discomfort is a warning sign instead of a training ground. Stoicism teaches the opposite. Feelings are information, not instruction. They arrive uninvited, they fluctuate, and they rarely care about consequences. Long-term stability, on the other hand, is built slowly, deliberately, and often against the pull of immediate emotional relief. When emotions are allowed to lead unchecked, decisions become reactive instead of reflective. The present moment starts bullying the future. This is where marriages quietly lose their balance. Emotional prioritization sounds compassionate on the surface. It wears the mask of authenticity. But underneath, it often creates instability because emotions demand constant novelty, reassurance, and validation. They want movement, not maintenance. They crave intensity, not consistency. And when you organize a lifelong partnership around fluctuating emotional states, you're asking something permanent to bend around something temporary. That tension never disappears, it just waits. Epictetus warned, if you are ruled by passions, you are ruled by externals. When emotions take the wheel, external circumstances gain power. Moods begin to dictate standards. Feelings become justifications. Today's dissatisfaction becomes tomorrow's rationalization. Over time, stability is reframed as stagnation. Discipline is mistaken for indifference. Predictability is mislabeled as boredom. The tragedy is that the very things that make marriage sustainable, routine, duty, restraint, long-term thinking, are the first to be questioned when emotions are elevated above all else. You need to understand this clearly. Emotions are real, but they are not wise. They evolve to help you survive moments, not steward decades. When short-term emotional fulfillment becomes the metric for decision-making, commitment starts to feel conditional. Stability begins to feel negotiable. And once stability is treated as optional, everything else becomes fragile. Stoicism never asked you to suppress emotion. It asked you to govern it. Seneca put it bluntly, "He who indulges in empty fears earns himself real fears." When emotions are indulged without discipline, they multiply, they escalate. They start demanding sacrifices, often from the future. Long-term stability requires tolerating emotional discomfort without panicking. It requires the strength to sit with unease without rewriting reality to escape it. That strength isn't taught anymore. It's avoided. If you want to change this pattern, the first habit you must adopt is separating how you feel from what you decide. Feelings can speak, but they don't vote. When an emotional impulse arises, pause, create space. Ask yourself not, "How do I feel right now?" but "What kind of future does this choice build?" This single question introduces time into your thinking, and time is the enemy of impulsive emotion. Here's a simple daily exercise. At the end of the day, write down one moment where emotion wanted control, just one. Then write what would have happened if it had won completely. No drama, no storytelling, just cause and effect. This trains your mind to see beyond the immediate emotional payoff and reconnects you with consequence. Another Stoic principle you must reclaim is voluntary discomfort, not punishment, training. Reminded himself, choose not to be harmed and you won't feel harmed. Stability grows when you stop treating emotional discomfort as damage. When you allow yourself to feel unsettled without needing to act, explain, fix, or escape, you build resilience. You become harder to manipulate by your own internal weather. There's also the habit of reframing desire. Emotions often disguise desire as necessity. Stoicism teaches you to interrogate this illusion. Ask yourself, is this emotion asking for growth or relief? Growth is usually quiet and uncomfortable. Relief is loud and urgent. The more you learn to spot the difference, the less power fleeting emotions have over permanent commitments. You should also practice what the Stoics called mentally rehearsing future strain, not to be pessimistic, but to be prepared. Stability isn't built by assuming things will always feel good. It's built by accepting that they won't and committing anyway. When you expect emotional fluctuation, you stop being shocked by it. And what no longer shocks you no longer controls you. Most importantly, you must re-anchor your sense of meaning. Emotions make terrible gods. They demand worship but offer no guidance. Stoicism replaces emotional worship with principle. When principles lead, emotions fall into place. When emotions lead, principles are rewritten to keep up. This isn't about blame. It's about responsibility. If you want a marriage that lasts, you must train yourself to value endurance over excitement, direction over sensation, and long-term peace over short-term emotional spikes. That training doesn't happen accidentally. It happens daily, quietly, and intentionally. So start today. Observe your emotions without obeying them. Choose actions that your future self would thank you for. Practice restraint not as deprivation, but as self-respect. Because the strongest relationships aren't built on how intensely you feel in the moment. They're built on how steadily you think across time. And as the Stoics understood long before modern psychology caught up, mastery of emotion isn't coldness, it's freedom. Number 7. Weaponizing intimacy and affection. Weaponizing intimacy and affection doesn't start as cruelty. It starts quietly, almost invisibly, and that's why it's so destructive. Intimacy was meant to be a bridge, something that creates safety, closeness, and trust. But when affection becomes conditional, when warmth is granted or withdrawn as leverage, intimacy stops being love and starts becoming control. You feel it before you can name it. A subtle shift. Approval feels earned instead of shared. Touch becomes transactional. Emotional closeness is no longer an expression of connection, but a tool used to shape your behavior. And the most dangerous part, it's rarely spoken aloud. It's implied. Silence does the heavy lifting. The Stoics warned about this long before modern relationships ever existed. Wrote that suffering comes not from events themselves, but from the judgments we attach to them. When intimacy is weaponized, your mind is trained to associate peace with compliance. You start believing that emotional safety must be purchased through appeasement, restraint, or self-erasure. That belief corrodes your inner stability. You begin negotiating with yourself. You suppress truth for harmony. You abandon clarity for comfort. And slowly, you drift away from who you were before approval became currency. This dynamic thrives on emotional dependency. When affection is used as reward and distance as punishment, your nervous system stays on alert. You don't relax into connection, you monitor it. You read tone, you calculate timing. You adjust your emotional posture to avoid withdrawal. That constant self-regulation drains you, not because intimacy is demanding, but because fear is. Seneca warned that he who lives in fear will never be free. And yet, fear disguised as love is one of the most common prisons men step into, without realizing the door has closed behind them. Stoicism doesn't ask you to become cold, it asks you to become grounded. When affection is healthy, it flows freely. When it's weaponized, it's rationed. The difference matters. One nourishes, the other trains obedience. Over time, you stop asking what you want and start asking what will keep the peace. You trade authenticity for predictability. You mistake emotional scarcity for depth. But scarcity doesn't make love valuable. It makes it unstable. Here, where responsibility enters not as blame but as power. You cannot control how someone chooses to use intimacy, but you can control what you tolerate, what you internalize, and what you reinforce. Epictetus was brutally clear. Some things are up to you and some things are not. Your reactions belong to you. Your boundaries belong to you. Your self-respect is not negotiable, even when affection is dangled in front of you like a prize. When intimacy becomes a bargaining chip, the antidote is inner independence. You must stop outsourcing your emotional stability. The moment affection becomes your primary source of peace, it becomes your greatest vulnerability. Stoicism teaches emotional self-sufficiency, not isolation but resilience. You learn to stand calmly in emotional fluctuation without panicking. You stop chasing reassurance. You stop performing for warmth. You choose clarity over comfort, even when that choice feels lonely at first. This is where practice matters more than insight. Start with a daily reflection. Ask yourself quietly and honestly, if affection disappeared today, would my sense of self collapse? Don't judge the answer. Observe it. Awareness is the first fracture in the illusion. Then train emotional neutrality. When affection is present, receive it without clinging. When it's absent, remain composed. This is not withdrawal. This is strength. You are teaching your nervous system that your worth does not fluctuate with someone else's emotional availability. Another exercise is intentional truth. Speak small truths consistently, even when it risks temporary discomfort. Not confrontation, not emotional dumping, just calm honesty. Stoicism values alignment between inner conviction and outer expression. Each time you suppress yourself to maintain affection, you reinforce the weapon. Each time you remain calm and truthful, you disarm it. You must also train selective attachment. Affection should be a complement to your life, not its foundation. Anchor yourself in purpose, discipline, and self-respect. When your life is full, intimacy becomes shared joy instead of emotional oxygen. That shift alone changes the entire dynamic. Power dissolves when dependency disappears. This isn't about winning control back. It's about stepping out of the game entirely. Weaponized intimacy survives on emotional hunger. Stoic calm starves it. When you are steady, present, and unreactive, manipulation has nothing to grip. You don't beg, you don't chase, you don't retaliate. You simply remain yourself, rooted, composed, and clear. The deeper lesson is this: love that requires you to abandon your center isn't love, no matter how intense it feels. Stoicism reminds you that peace is the highest good. Any relationship that teaches you to sacrifice peace for affection is teaching you the wrong lesson. And the moment you internalize that, intimacy either becomes healthier or it loses its power over you. Take this seriously, not angrily, not defensively. Calmly, train your mind, reclaim your emotional independence. Let affection be a gift, not a leash. When you do, you don't just protect your marriage, you protect yourself. Number 8. Refusal to take accountability for personal faults. Refusal to take accountability for personal faults is one of the quietest, most corrosive forces inside a marriage. And if you want to understand why so many unions slowly decay, you have to look here without flinching. If someone is able to show me that what I think or do is not right, I will happily change, wrote. That sentence alone exposes the fracture. Accountability is not about blame. It is about ownership. And when ownership disappears, respect follows it out the door. When you refuse to look inward, you unconsciously train yourself to believe that the problem is always external. The marriage becomes a courtroom. You are the prosecutor. Your partner is always on trial, and peace has no seat in the room. You feel it when responsibility is avoided. Conversations don't resolve, they recycle. Apologies sound strategic rather than sincere. Growth becomes impossible because growth requires friction, and friction requires humility. When personal faults are, your inner world hardens. You stop asking, "What am I contributing to this?" and start asking only, "Why am I being wronged?" That shift feels protective at first. It feels empowering. But over time, it quietly strips you of influence. Because the one thing you can always change in a relationship is yourself. When you refuse that leverage, you give away your power. Stoicism cuts straight through this illusion. Epictetus warned, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." Accountability feels foolish to the ego. It feels like weakness. But in truth, it is the highest form of strength. The ability to say, "This part is mine," without excuses, without qualifiers, without dragging the past into the present. When that ability disappears, emotional maturity collapses with it. You may still speak of love, but love without accountability becomes entitlement. And entitlement poisons intimacy. Notice how resistance to accountability often hides behind language that sounds reasonable. You tell yourself you're just reacting, that you're justified, that circumstances made you this way. But Stoicism teaches that your reactions are always yours. Always. External events don't force your character to decay. They merely reveal what you've been avoiding. When you reject responsibility, you also reject self-mastery. You become a hostage to moods, narratives, and shifting emotions. And a marriage cannot survive long when one person refuses to govern themselves. This is where the damage deepens. When accountability is absent, self-reflection dies. And without self-reflection, patterns repeat endlessly. You don't correct behaviors, you defend them. You don't listen, you prepare counterarguments. You don't soften, you fortify. Over time, this creates emotional distance that no amount of communication can bridge, because communication without accountability is just noise. The Stoics understood this clearly. Seneca wrote, "We suffer more often in imagination than in reality." When you refuse accountability, imagination takes over. You imagine yourself as perpetually misunderstood, perpetually wronged, perpetually entitled to compensation. Reality, meanwhile, continues to deteriorate. If you want to interrupt this cycle, you must train yourself to move toward discomfort instead of away from it. Accountability is uncomfortable because it dismantles the stories you tell yourself to stay emotionally safe. But safety without truth is just slow decay. You don't need to become self-critical. You need to become self-honest. There's a difference. Self-criticism weakens you. Self-honesty stabilizes you. One erodes confidence. The other builds respect, both self-respect and relational respect. Here is a practice you can begin today. At the end of each day, ask yourself one question and do not soften it. Where did I avoid responsibility today? Not where you were hurt, not where you were disappointed, where you avoided ownership. Write the answer plainly. No explanations, no justifications, just the raw behavior. This exercise is not about guilt. It is about clarity, and clarity is power. Another practice. When conflict arises, delay your response, not to manipulate but to examine yourself first. Before speaking, ask, what part of this is within my control? If the answer is none, you're lying to yourself. There is always something within your control, your tone, your assumptions, your expectations, your reactions. Stoicism is ruthless here, and that's why it works. It gives you responsibility whether you want it or not, and in doing so, it gives you freedom. You may notice resistance rising as you read this. That's normal. Resistance is the ego defending its territory. But remember, the ego wants comfort, character wants growth. When accountability is embraced, something subtle shifts. Conversations become cleaner. Tension dissolves faster. Respect returns, not because someone else changed, but because you did. And that is the only change that ever truly lasts. If you want a marriage that doesn't slowly rot under silent resentment, you must abandon the habit of externalizing blame. You must stop waiting to be understood and start becoming accountable. This is not submission. This is sovereignty. This is choosing mastery over martyrdom. The Stoics didn't seek comfort, they sought alignment. And alignment begins the moment you stop asking who is at fault and start asking who you are becoming. Take responsibility, not because you are guilty, but because you are capable. Number 9, allowing external influences to dominate the marriage. When a marriage begins to fracture, it's rarely because of one explosive moment. It erodes quietly. And one of the most subtle corrosive forces is when outside voices begin to outweigh the inner bond. When opinions, expectations, trends, and emotional noise from the world seep into what should be a closed system. You don't notice it at first. It feels harmless. Advice here, validation there, a comment that lingers, a comparison that sticks. But over time, the marriage stops being guided by shared values and starts being steered by external influence. And that's where the damage begins. The Stoics warned relentlessly about this. Wrote, if you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. Read that again. The issue isn't the outside voice. It's the permission given to it. When external opinions begin to dominate your perception of your partner, your role, or your expectations, you slowly surrender authority over your own marriage. The bond becomes porous, and what should be intimate becomes performative. You begin to measure your relationship not by its internal health, but by how it looks, how it compares, how it's judged. This is where many women unknowingly sabotage the very stability they crave, not through malice, not through intent, but through overexposure, too many inputs, too many emotional mirrors, too many borrowed standards. Instead of asking, is this working for us? The question becomes, is this normal, or worse, is this enough according to everyone else? Stoicism would call this a failure of sovereignty. You've allowed the crowd to become the compass. Seneca was blunt about this danger. He who lives in harmony with himself lives in harmony with the universe. A marriage is no different. Harmony cannot exist when the rules are constantly rewritten by outsiders, when every disagreement is filtered through third-party judgment. When private matters become public currency in the mind, the marriage loses its gravity. Decisions become reactive. Emotions become amplified. Resentment grows not because of what your partner did, but because of what someone else said it meant. Pause here. Take responsibility, not blame responsibility. Ask yourself who is shaping your emotional responses, who gets a vote in your marriage when things feel uncertain. Because every time you consult the outside world before consulting your values, you weaken your position. Stoicism teaches you to narrow the field of influence, to become selective, to guard your inner citadel. Epictetus said, "If you want to be invincible, make sure that no external thing has power over you." A marriage cannot be invincible if it is governed by external pressure. This doesn't mean isolation. It means discernment. It means choosing depth over noise. It means understanding that intimacy thrives in privacy, not exposure. When external voices dominate, the marriage becomes crowded. There's no room for patience, no space for grace, no margin for growth. Every flaw feels fatal. Every conflict feels validated by someone else's opinion. And slowly you stop solving problems together. You outsource meaning. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. External influence often feels empowering at first. It feels like clarity, like awakening, like finally seeing things for what they are. But Stoicism would ask you a harder question. Are you seeing clearly, or are you being pulled? Are you acting from reason or reacting from stimulation? Because the Stoics believed reason must govern emotion, not the other way around. And when your emotional state is constantly shaped by outside input, reason never gets the wheel. You can reverse this, but it requires discipline. Start by shrinking the circle of influence. Mentally list who has earned the right to shape your thinking about your marriage. Be ruthless. Most opinions are unearned. Most advice is projection. Most validation is cheap. Practice silence, not outward silence, but inward restraint. You don't need to process every feeling with external confirmation. Strength grows when you sit with your thoughts and examine them before broadcasting them. Here's a practical Stoic exercise. At the end of the day, ask yourself 3 questions. What external opinion affected me today? Did it improve my judgment or weaken it? Did I act from reason or reaction? Write the answers. Don't justify them. Observe them. This is straight from Nightly Reflections. Awareness precedes control. Another exercise. When you feel emotionally charged about your marriage, delay interpretation. Epictetus taught the discipline of assent. Don't immediately agree with your first impression. Tell yourself, this is an impression, not a fact. Create space. That space is where wisdom lives. External voices lose power when you slow down your internal response. Also practice value anchoring. Define in writing what your marriage stands for, not culturally, not socially. Yours. Values are the antidote to external domination. When values are clear, opinions become background noise. Without values, every voice sounds like authority. This is where Stoicism becomes liberating. You stop needing consensus. You stop chasing validation. You stop letting comparison rot your peace. You return to what is within your control, your judgment, your behavior, your standards. And when you do that, the marriage regains stability. Not because everything becomes easy, but because everything becomes grounded. Remember this. No marriage collapses under pressure alone. It collapses when pressure is internalized without scrutiny, when outside voices are trusted more than inner principles. The Stoics didn't seek to escape the world. They sought to remain uncorrupted by it. You can do the same. Choose sovereignty over stimulation. Choose discipline over drama. Choose reason over reaction. And most importantly, reclaim authority over your own relationship. Because the moment external influence stops dominating your marriage is the moment strength quietly returns. Number 10. Gradual erosion of admiration and gratitude. When admiration fades, the relationship doesn't explode, it slowly leaks meaning. And that's the danger. You don't notice it at first because it doesn't arrive as cruelty or chaos. It arrives as silence where appreciation used to live, as familiarity replacing reverence, as the quiet assumption that what once felt rare is now guaranteed. You feel it when gratitude becomes optional, when effort is no longer seen but expected, when presence is taken for granted rather than received with awareness. This is how erosion works, not with violence but with neglect. And if you're honest with yourself, you can sense how this slow decay reshapes the emotional climate of a marriage long before anyone admits something is wrong. Admiration is oxygen. Without it, desire weakens, respect thins, and resentment finds room to breathe. Gratitude is the discipline that keeps admiration alive. When gratitude disappears, entitlement quietly takes its place. You stop seeing what is given and start measuring what is missing. The mind becomes a courtroom instead of a sanctuary, and this shift is rarely conscious. It happens incrementally through repetition. Through the inner dialogue that says, "This is normal now," instead of, "This still matters." Stoic philosophy warned against this exact blindness, reminded us that the soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. When gratitude is absent from your thoughts, your emotional tone darkens without you realizing it. What makes this erosion so destructive is that it rewires how you perceive your partner. Admiration turns into comparison. Gratitude turns into expectation. The extraordinary becomes invisible. You don't wake up deciding to devalue what you once cherished. You simply stop training your attention to see it. And attention, as the Stoics understood, is a moral act. Epictetus taught that what you choose to focus on determines the quality of your inner life. When appreciation is no longer practiced, dissatisfaction doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like truth. That's how the mind convinces itself it's justified, even when it's quietly poisoning the bond. If you want to reverse this pattern, you must begin by reclaiming agency over your perception. Stoicism is not about suppressing emotion, it's about governing it. Start with this exercise. Once a day, deliberately name, internally, 3 qualities you respect, value, or appreciate. Not because they are rare, but precisely because they are consistent. Consistency is what sustains a marriage, yet it's the first thing the mind dismisses. This practice isn't sentimental, it's corrective. It retrains your attention to notice what familiarity has hidden. Seneca warned that nothing is more honorable than a grateful heart, because gratitude restores proportion to the mind. Another discipline is to interrupt entitlement the moment it appears. Entitlement disguises itself as fairness. It says, "This should already be happening." But Stoicism asks you to challenge that assumption. Nothing is owed. Everything given is a gift of choice, energy, and time. When you reframe expectations as voluntary acts, admiration returns naturally. You don't need grand gestures. You need clarity. Ask yourself, am I responding to effort with recognition, or am I consuming it silently? The answer tells you exactly where erosion has begun. You must also understand that admiration cannot coexist with contempt, even in subtle forms. Contempt doesn't always sound harsh. Sometimes it sounds like indifference, sometimes like boredom, sometimes like constant mental correction. The Stoics believe that inner speech shapes outer reality. If your internal language strips value from what is present, your emotional response will follow. Replace mental criticism with neutral observation. Replace judgment with awareness. This isn't passive. It's disciplined. And discipline, not emotion, is what sustains long-term connection. There is also a deeper layer to gratitude that most people ignore. Gratitude for effort, not outcome. When appreciation is conditional on results, admiration becomes unstable. Stoicism teaches you to respect intention and effort because they are within human control, while outcomes are not. Begin acknowledging energy, commitment, and consistency rather than perfection. This shift alone dissolves much of the silent resentment that corrodes marriages from the inside. To embody this, practice voluntary acknowledgement. Once daily, express appreciation, not dramatically, not excessively, but clearly. The Stoics believed in brevity and sincerity. Let recognition be simple and direct. No qualifiers, no comparisons, just acknowledgement. This act does more than reassure the other person. It reshapes your own perception. You become the kind of mind that sees value instead of hunting for flaws, and that identity shift is everything. Finally, understand this truth. Admiration is not sustained by emotion, but by choice. Gratitude is not a feeling, it's a habit. And habits are built through repetition, not inspiration. Wrote his meditations as reminders, not revelations, because even wisdom fades without rehearsal. If you want a marriage that doesn't decay quietly, you must rehearse appreciation the same way you rehearse responsibility. Take action now. Audit your attention, train your gratitude, govern your inner speech. Restore admiration before resentment convinces you it's too late, because erosion is reversible, but only if you catch it while it's still silent. Before you react, pause. This video wasn't about blaming, it was about seeing clearly. Most marriages don't collapse from one dramatic betrayal. They erode quietly, through unchecked emotions, silent resentment, power struggles no one wants to admit exist. And once you understand how that erosion happens, you stop being a victim of it. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Awareness is rare, and rare awareness creates rare outcomes. If you can recognize these patterns early, you gain leverage. Not to control, but to choose wisely. To set boundaries, to lead with calm strength instead of emotional chaos. Remember this, you are not here to beg for harmony. You are here to build it through clarity, self-mastery, and standards. And whether you're married, single, or deciding who deserves access to your life, what you've learned today gives you an edge most people never develop. If this video made you think, even if it made you uncomfortable, that's a good sign. It means you're ahead of the curve. If you want more truth like this, unfiltered, grounded, and rooted in psychological reality, make sure you subscribe. Watch the next video. Don't ignore the patterns that destroy most lives. Because the man who understands reality is the man who never gets by it.